Anybody? Anybody? The Ramones? Does anybody even listen to the Ramones anymore?
No, but
nobody listens to the Ramones anymore.
Did
The
you
Ramones?
listen to the Ramones?
No, I never did get the Ramones. People are like cult crazy about the Ramones. I never did. First of all, I'm just gonna say this for the record. I want my rock stars, both
Joey
men and
Ramone.
women, to be fucking attractive. Okay, is that too much to ask that they're attractive? Is that too much?
I don't know.
Is that super? Is that shallow? Is that superficial? Is it? If it is, I'm a shallow, superficial person.
Bart brought us in with a warm open one more time. This is the end of season 5. If you are jumping in with us, this is hashtag SPSM. This is the Suicide Prevention Social Media Chat. This is our closer for season 5. And this is really the closer for sort of this iteration while we sort of shut down and work on launching the next thing. And we had a very different show planned for you tonight. And that's not going to
There were going to be fireworks. There were going to be, we had 3 guest stars bringing in animals. There was a, what is that? What do you call that, Chris?
Noisemaker.
Yes. Yeah, there were going to be those.
We get to be the noisemakers.
And now you just get to hear us talk about suicide for an hour.
Which the whole nation has been talking about suicide in the news really, really, really constantly. So lots of people, some of us that you know, and then a lot of other people who don't usually talk about suicide. We've seen varying degrees of we've seen just a huge diversity in messaging, a lot of degrees of competence in talking about it, a lot of thoughts. Like this is like everyone's talking about it. I mean, in some ways it's a little chaotic. We're here kind of to break down some of what happened this week, especially related to the SPSM community, because a lot of SPSMers were in the media talking about suicide. And, just sort of looking back, when we started this in 2013, there was a group of us at Frank's in Austin following the AAS conference talking about how our field was only talking to itself, that we were very media averse, that people didn't seem to know how to use new media or social media, that they didn't seem to want to talk with the media, and that it was very, very hard to get media events together. We thought we could do something about that, as well as look at technology and innovation and things that we thought were missed opportunities, where the suicide prevention community not connected with technology and innovation might be missing something. That was 5 years ago. But Chris Maxwell, AAS communications director, and we'll do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll end with Chris. And Chris will take you into just the huge list of things that happened this week. Many of you are watching, because this week, all of us were shook at some point or other this week. Tony Wood, say hi to the people.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tony Wood. I'm the chair of the board of the American Association of Suicidology, as well as the COO of Quantify, a software company dedicated to machine learning and mental health and wellness.
Bart Andrews.
Dr. Bart Andrews. You can catch me on Twitter at Bart Andrews. I'm the vice president of telehealth, home and community services at Behavioral Health Response, a groovy little crisis center in St. Louis, Missouri that's been very busy the last week with all the activity. I'll give shout outs to a lot of folks throughout the show because BHR did some amazing work. I am on the executive committee for the American Association of Suicidology. Very proud of that. Proud of the work that AAS did this week. There was so much good stuff that happened this week. There's so much to talk about. I have a lot of thoughts, and I was actually at an training for trainers while all this was happening, which added an interesting dimension for me. But I'm really excited. I want to pass this over to Chris Maxwell, who was a certifiable rock star this week with all of his efforts. Chris.
General Chris Maxwell leading the troops this week.
That's okay. Hey, everybody, I'm Chris Maxwell. I am communications coordinator for AAS, and I'm also on the board for the National Association of Crisis Organization Directors. A couple of quick things coming up here in July. So in a few weeks, we're going to have a call for papers for next year's AAS conference. So keep an eye out for those if you want to make sure that you have a presentation that gets presented. And then NASCOD and CUSA, Contact USA, are opening up the registration for the National Crisis Center Conference coming up in October. And you can go to crisiscon.org to find that registration information. I had to get that out of the way. Secondly, and really more important, I want to give like some massive shout outs to everyone who played a huge fucking role this week, because it was so intense. And so we have, and if I forget anyone, I swear I will go back and tweet out who you were. But our communications committee was integral to all of our responses, and formulating our key messages when it came to the three major things, the three major current events. Who else? Julie Searle was an awesome rock star this week. She did a whole bunch of media.
Oh my God.
Julie Searle, president of the American Association of Suicide.
One of my first interactions with Julie Searle was during the 2014 AAS conference, where we were talking about letting Hollywood producers in and having them sit down, and that we would invite the media into our conference. And I remember her saying, my gut is anxious, but I'm willing to hear about this. She went from sort of that reaction to media to she was a media explosion this week. Anyway, go ahead.
So yeah, I mean, she did. I had countless number of interviews. Melinda Moore, who's on the board of AAS as well. She's the clinical division director.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So she's great. She did a couple of interviews. Who else helped out? Jonathan Singer, John Ackerman played a role. Colleen Crichton we loaded her up with a ton of interviews. She's the executive director for AAS. Who else? I know I'm forgetting people. We had Des giving interviews. We had
Mike Anestis.
Anestis. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Jonathan Singer was writing for Fortune. Like we were calling, like you were just, Kevin Hines was doing media. We had people, John Draper was doing stuff like, I think everyone, like it was either in AAS or SPSM, and almost everybody was both. We just kept seeing people who we knew, right? What kinds of, Chris, so first of all, for people are going to be watching back to this, hopefully, like to come back, like to sort of this point in time. And this is really a moment where it was really visible that the field had turned a corner in terms of its media engagement. And quite painfully this week, Kate Spade died by suicide, Anthony Bourdain died by suicide, and right in the middle of it, the CDC launched its report, which said the suicide rates have gone up again, and it's really, really troubling. And so in the middle of this, people just couldn't stop talking about it, right? What kinds of things were you seeing, Chris?
I mean, anything and everything. The spectrum was wide and long this week. So we had the traditional media, we had NYT, we had Washington Post, the traditional stuff. We saw stuff from Mashable and some other online outlets that have huge followings. What's been really interesting is watching the different responses, not only between the two celebrities who took their lives, but just about suicide in general on social media like Reddit. I don't go deeply into the terrifying depths of like 4chan and some other scarier ones, but Reddit is pretty pervasive. And again, we just saw a really big shift in how it was being addressed. Suicide in general was being talked about in a preventable way. People were kind of helping each other out in comments. There were also, of course, the trolls. But so yeah, I mean, it really, and really what we were seeing was kind of a coordinated messaging happening between a lot of the different organizations, between a lot of the different people who were being interviewed. And it really focused around this idea that it's preventable. There's hope. We need research funding. We need implementation funding. It was very, very impressive. And I don't think I've ever seen, in the several years that I've been in this field, I don't think I've ever seen something quite like that.
Yeah. So my experience was, getting asked all sorts of questions. So I did an interview with Marketplace, and one of the things they were like, now I know that you talk about mental health and stuff, but this is really Marketplace, so we have to talk about funding. And I remember him almost being very apologetic, like we have to do a time, but this is such a newsworthy event that even though it's mental health, we're going to talk about money. And I'm like, so glad, Marketplace, that you want to talk about money. Let's talk about money, because that is a very serious issue related to whether or not research gets done, whether or not innovation gets done, whether or not people get care, all that sort of stuff. And he was like, why don't people get funding? And I'm like, I don't know. That's a great question. Why doesn't the American public want to pay for this, right? And like then I got to tell Marketplace, well, fuck yeah, when we spend money on other causes of death, guess what? The mortality rate drops. Do you fucking tell me, right? I maybe didn't say so you fucking tell me to Marketplace, but that was sort of my thought. Go ahead, Chris.
No, that's exactly the right. There are these talking points that are out there that we've probably been using for quite a while, but I wasn't even aware of the fact that the smallpox factor figure for how much is being spent on smallpox prevention is so huge when suicide prevention federally is so tiny. So just having people ready to respond to the media blitz that happened again, but in such a way that we were able to really highlight, this is what we can do, this is what we should know, run it.
And I would like to point out that you didn't have time to write talking points for every AAS member that you were setting up with the media. People just had to be ready. It was like, here's an email, you need to be ready. So you need to know what you're doing. And we've talked about that in the past, which is we know someone's going to die because this cause of death isn't getting any less, it's getting more. So the issue is we know, and we remember this following Robin Williams' death. And Jonathan Singer, you're tweeting right now, you were there helping us analyze and so they were like, okay, we know this is going to happen again. So were we ready enough? And this time, how much time do you even spend prepping people?
Is that like none? I didn't have to do any prepping. Due to some really smart decisions on Colleen's part, in the last few weeks, we have actually internally gone through and kind of revamped the strategy for how we distribute media requests. So luckily, she had enough foresight to have that ready to go. And so when this week happened, we were able to really pinpoint who we wanted to answer what story, what AAS member was specifically a subject matter expert on X, or what we wanted them to focus on. And so we were able to just kind of dole out these stories as the media requests came in. It was pretty amazing to watch. I would say, so our release was developed and produced by 7:30 Friday. I'm just talking about Anthony Bourdain's because that was the probably the most ridiculous in terms of media response. But we had the release out by 7:30 in the morning on Friday, and within 2 hours, we had already had like 15 media requests scheduled and probably half that number already done. So it was super, super amazing to watch in action.
And so that's what we've been talking about, right, for a long time at SPSM. It's just you kind of have to be ready for this, and you just kind of have to have the skills. Like the time to learn how to be a firefighter is not when somebody sees smoke. The time is you train and then you respond. And so that's what happened. Scott Tiernan, hey Scott. By the way, there are a lot of people here tonight. Feels like homecoming. So hi to P.F. Anderson, hi to Carl Dunn, Anne Marie, Marshall, Scott, Sanford James. There's so many. Noreen is here. Scott Tiernan says, I normally don't try to ask questions, but I'm interested in hearing, if you hadn't planned on addressing this, what role this week's deaths have done to raise mental health awareness? Like, how did that play out, Chris?
Yeah, again, I think it was just the way that things were being talked about, both in terms of mental health, depression, suicide and suicide prevention. The just sheer number of media stories that focused on how community supports can play a huge role. was very interesting. So I've started seeing a shift, and this came out in the CDC report too, this shift away from pushing and encouraging people to only call the Lifeline or only use CTL, crisis text line, or only go and find a professional that they should talk to. But really this overall messaging about making sure that the community is prepared for a response and that you have the ability to go and be there for somebody and ask them how they're doing and provide them support. So that's kind of what I've seen in an awareness sense, is that we are really kind of pushing this empowerment aspect and this ability to be there for our neighbors outside of this clinical approach that's been pretty typical.
And I will say there were several essays. I was just looking at Andrew Solomon's essay in the New York Times, right, Chris, that was talking about the CDC's report that it's not necessarily for the first time. The majority of the numbers aren't people with an identified mental illness, but they're people under deep, intense strain. People are talking, and I know Bart loves this bit, which is that what is it about our society that is making people want to die? And so people were asking about sort of ambient stressors, about community connectedness, about trauma, things like that, about not having, like, Americans maybe not feeling like they have lives worth living right now. And that being a message that was really resonating with people related to suicide, which is connectedness and how do you build a life worth living under what has been really hard economic times, especially if you're a white male with less education. In the last 10 years. Bart?
Is that you're queuing me up? Oh, hey everybody. No, so I one of the things that I'm encouraged by was this is the first time I've seen it at a national level, a concerted discussion about not tagging suicide as a mental health only issue. And I think that's a huge step forward. Now, there's some challenges here. This is one of the things. The more I learn about suicide, the more reading I do, the more research I'm exposed to. I think it's abundantly clear that suicide's indeterminate. There are multiple pathways. In fact, there are possibly infinite pathways to suicide. So we can't put all of our approaches in one bucket. And so there's this really interesting dynamic that's going on. There's a bunch of folks who are rightfully excited to see that the CDC report points out that half the people who die of suicide didn't have significant mental health histories, which kind of really connects with the psychological autopsy criticism that when you look at psychological autopsy data, which is where we get the 90% figure. So everybody out in SPSM land has heard that 90% of suicides are connected to a serious mental health issue. That's from psychological autopsy data. What nobody wants to talk about is that psychological autopsy data is incredibly biased towards finding serious mental illness. And it actually ranges from anywhere from double to triple the occurrence of what actually is likely to be present in the population when you do a psychological autopsy. So they're 2 to 3 times more likely to say someone who dies of suicide has a mental illness than when they know the person died of suicide. That's really what the research tells us. So this was good. Not to get too far in the weeds, which I think I did, but at the same time, there are folks that are so hooked on this suicide isn't just a mental health issue that they're saying it's not a mental health issue at all, and that this is completely about our culture and about our society. And there was a Mad in America post going around that actually was kind of good at first, but also had lots of bad information where that only the suicide rates are highest in the countries that are the happiest. That's simply not true. That's sort of true in some instances, and it's not true in other instances. So anybody who takes, so here's my 2 cents on this. I'm glad that we've broken up the conversation and we're starting to look at cultural dynamics. We're starting to say that this just is a mental health issue, but we need to have efforts that focus both on people who are getting mental health services, that are getting healthcare. We need to look at the healthcare end, which is the kind of the zero suicide approach. And we also need to be much more focused on folks that aren't in mental health care, that aren't getting services and don't meet criteria for mental illness. And I don't think we do a very good job of that, by and large, is my 2 cents.
So P.F. Anderson, one argument going on via my Facebook stream centers around a guy who says the fuss is ridiculous because most Americans aren't depressed and aren't suicidal. I caught a straw man because suicide impact doesn't require a 50% threshold. P.F. Anderson, I want to do a reply to that tweet. 50%, most Americans don't have breast cancer. Most Americans don't have HIV. Most Americans don't have a lot of things, and we'll put a fuck ton of resources into it. Most Americans don't have fucking smallpox. You want to know how many Americans have smallpox? I'll tell you, P.F. Anderson, how many Americans have smallpox? 0, and we spend the exact same amount on preventing smallpox as we do suicide. So you can tell them that. Sorry, had a minute. Responded to the tweet. Went somewhere I didn't intend. Can we do hashtag emotional on our thing? Maybe.
Well, it's interesting to me. I think.
What do you think of that, Chris? Chris,
wait, don't we spend more on smallpox?
We spend slightly more on smallpox, right?
Yeah.
We don't spend slightly. I mean, we spend a lot more on smallpox than we do on prevention.
And it's not. We don't live in Little House on the Prairie days. What the hell?
Well, you know, I mean, it's a thing.
Sorry. Bart, you were saying? Okay, so Jedi Council posted a tweet, and I'm going to pitch this to Bart right about now. So Jedi Council posted a tweet talking about all sorts of resources. You can check it out in the Twitter stream. While we're talking about this next little bit about the impact of all this media on help seeking and like what behaviors does it functionally change, go check out the Jedi Council's tweet. And if you saw an article that an SPSMer was in or that just interested you, can you guys start tweeting out the links to this? Because we can give this to Chris Maxwell, and AAS can do stuff with that. If we can get tweets to some of the fabulous resources and interviews that have appeared that we think should be curated in this moment. But Bart, one of the things that people are talking about, we talked about this with Logic Songs on the Grammys, that when there is publicity, access to our crisis call centers goes up. Can you talk about that? Oh, please, Bart, let this not be the time your internet crashes.
And it crashed.
And it crashed. Oh, wait, he's back.
He's moving now. He's moving now.
Did you hear what we said?
Yeah, I'm telling you, my Wi-Fi. What I miss, everybody? Fill me in.
So I'm asking you to talk about how call center numbers go up. And so you were telling us Angela Behavioral Health Response was a real hero this week because she was managing the spike. So tell us about what call volume does during these events.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the Wall Street Journal article that Lifeline showed 25% increase in call volume. Can you hear me?
Yep, go for it.
Boy, this is bad. So I apologies to the audience. My Wi-Fi is really acting up. So BHR's volume was also up. I don't have hard data yet. But here's what we see when we see these incidents as the news trickles out. One of the hugest changes in suicide prevention is access and this national number of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. This is a big deal. It used to be that people had to only promote their local number. You couldn't put out a national number. The idea now that we have this national number, that anybody who's saying, hey, if you're worried about somebody or if you're thinking about suicide, this is tough news. If this is impacting you, call the Lifeline. That's absolutely incredible. I mean, it's one of the biggest advances that we have nationally in suicide prevention in the last 15 years. But that also causes call surges. So what you see is when we cover these issues, when this information is out there, we saw it with Robin Williams, call volume goes up and it goes up dramatically. So here's the challenge with that. Those of us that work in the crisis field understand that. You are funded and staffed to handle a certain level of volume. As calls increase, as more calls come in, you have to increase your staffing. You've got to bring more folks in. Often, like BHR, we have to pay folks overtime. We got to bring in folks for extra shifts. We've got to pay them more money to do that. Even if you're using a volunteer center, there's still a lot of labor and energy that goes on to getting these folks in, handling more calls. And so you have these spikes that can last this week. I imagine that it's been up all week. It'll probably usually recedes relatively quickly, a couple of days after the news cycle ends. That's one of the things, is when the news cycle ends, you'll see volume dropping. But you don't get another. So this is the challenge. That is money and labor and resources that you have used up that you don't get back. Right? It's not like you're going to get it's not like volume's going to drop way down the next week lower than it usually is. You're going to still have your normal volume regardless of what's going on. So call surges in crisis in any contact center work are a major bugaboo. because they're difficult to manage. They stress out the staff. You spend a lot of money. And most crisis lines, there are exceptions, most crisis lines aren't getting paid per call if they go over a certain amount, right? You've got your budget for the year or the quarter, whatever the case may be. And that means that when these things happen, we really put a tremendous amount of both emotional and physical labor on our crisis lines. They also are suffering a financial hit in the process. A lot of folks don't realize this. The Lifeline does not actually fund crisis centers. It was never set up that way. This is not in any way a knock on the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. They understand this fully well. The Lifeline was funded to create this network, to pay for the phone calls, to pay for coordination, and to create this network, not to fund the actual labor and the cost of answering the phones. They couldn't. Their budget wouldn't even cover, a flipping tenth of it, if that. And so now Lifeline has in the past, like with the Grammys, they anticipated that there was going to be a call surge because of the Grammys, and they were able to pull some money together to fund some backup centers. BHR was one of those centers, which was very, very cool. But the Lifeline has no resources to fund these call surges. So this is really important. Donating money to your local crisis line is a really, really good idea if they take donations. Many of them do. Many of them are nonprofits, and they're glad to get donations. Most are. But the crisis line workers are really the unsung heroes. While everybody else is out tweeting these numbers or Facebooking the numbers call, there's really human beings who are answering these flood of calls that are coming in, giving up their personal time to do that. Angela Tate, who is BHR's Vice President of Operations, who is amazing.
All around superhero, and I have a girl crush on her.
She's pretty amazing. You're not alone. She's pretty amazing. And not only was BHR experiencing call surges, but KSDK wanted to have a call bank at the TV studio while they're running stories, and so we got people to come and help with other agencies, help man that kind of impromptu contact center right there in the background. And actually, the call volume was pretty intense. We were sending outreaches from calls that were coming into the TV station. So that's incredible. It's amazing. But these are resources that are getting.
How much money did you get to do that?
I don't know if I can comment on that, but
okay. I'm sorry. Right. Marshall says, with all this 1-800-273-TALK tonight, I thought I put this out there that the North Carolina Lifeline almost didn't get any money in the new fiscal budget. That's damn straight. They expect call centers to save lives with no fucking money and volunteers, and to be there and for everyone to publicize it when they feel bad because suicide has happened and we don't want it to happen again. And Bart can't talk about money, but I can say that however much they got, I know it was not enough. We have several people on our Twitter stream, Bart, talking about supporting the responders because human beings had to listen to other human beings in pain at an increased rate. Well, then the responders are worn out. It's like firefighters going to fight a wildfire for a week straight. They're exhausted, and there's just not enough resources for that level of need. Anyway, sorry, Bart, didn't mean to get you in trouble.
No, but this is something that we should really be talking about. We are constantly pushing out the Suicide Lifeline phone number, but the federal government, for the most part, is not funding the crisis system. Some states, I will give major props to Missouri. Missouri has a statewide access crisis intervention system. It's broken up into a couple of different regions. It's not a centralized number, but they do truly fund crisis services and suicide prevention, making sure that there's professional caring staff 24/7 in every part of the state. That's very, very cool. So I think, but there's lots of states that don't do that. And it isn't funded in a way that you really can account for these incredible call surges or high call volume. Those are ongoing challenges, right? And things that we need to be thinking about.
Chris, you shared a tweet from P.F. Anderson. You want to talk Bart through that?
If I can unmute myself. Yeah, no, it sounds like there's a couple of interesting issues with religious contexts. And so if I read that one correctly, it was that some crisis counselors were having some issues talking with people who were either non-Christian or atheist or whatever the case may be. And I obviously can't speak to that or how individual crisis centers interact with their callers, but I will say that at least within the Lifeline, there are certain standards of training. There are ways that people are expected to talk about those things. But I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but I guess somebody on social media had railed against, or maybe not social media, but some other celebrity had railed against Anthony Bourdain and said that he was going to hell. I guess that was something that Marshman was pointing out too. I hadn't heard about this, but honestly, if Anthony Bourdain's going to hell, that sounds like a pretty fun place. I don't know.
The food will at least be good.
Yeah. But there's an interesting. There's always this interesting moral component. It's something that's going to be really, really difficult for us as a society to tear apart from suicide. And this is going to be a conversation point, I think, that happens every single time we lose a major celebrity, unfortunately, one way or the other.
And yeah. I want to just take a minute to recognize that Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain died, but 120 other Americans also died this week, or each day. I mean, that's not even this week. Each day, 120 other Americans died. Mm-hmm. And they're people who loved them, or they're all spending this week going, why? When we were doing all these media events, why do people die by suicide? And I was like, well, we don't know. Well, yeah, we do. And there are signs. No, not really. We don't know. And the research isn't very good. And then they were like, what do you mean? The research isn't very good. By the way, because we spend your money on smallpox and other things. We didn't spend it on suicide. Sorry. Anyway, I know. Stop, Foreman. But a whole bunch of people are trying to figure out why someone they loved is dead this week. We don't have good science. And that was the thing I kept trying to tell the media. Everyone wants to know the answer to that question. The public has to fund the science so that we can answer it a lot better than we have been. And then Bart didn't agree with me as much.
Yeah, I don't know. I think all these things are true at the same time. So how much research gets churned out about suicide every year? A lot. How much of that research is applied in a meaningful way? Almost fucking none. So I think one of the things that I get really worked up about is that, in fact, we have really good evidence that shows that certain approaches reduce the suicide rate. They reduce the suicide rate both at a public health level, and there's approaches that we take that reduce suicide at individual level. But very few healthcare agencies and healthcare providers are using evidence-based practices. So I think that to say that we don't have good research about how to prevent suicide or the things that are related to suicide, I don't think that's true in any way, shape, or form. I think the bigger issue is that we've got a field that has been unethical, irresponsible, and should be held accountable for not making sure that the professionals that are operating in healthcare are adequately trained in evidence-based practices to both detect and intervene with people at risk of suicide. So I think
what's the barrier, Bart?
What's the barriers that people don't give a shit? The barriers that people get away from with it, and there's very little consequence for not doing it. Although everybody's afraid about suicide death lawsuits, there's very, very few suicide death lawsuits. It's not a huge number, and so there's very little consequence to providing really bad suicide prevention care. The licensure boards, the three-lettered credential agencies, the American Psychological. Why the American Psychological Association doesn't say, dear God, every psychologist in the country should be adequately trained in evidence-based and using evidence-based practices. That's finally in California, graduate students are going to have in psychology are going to have suicide training. Missouri's finally passing a mandatory law that all mental health professionals except psychologists are going to have psychologists got themselves excluded. The psychologists got themselves excluded from the 2 hour training, which is still a huge deal. Let me just say this. I'm proud of Missouri.
Let me tell the story really quickly. Let me tell the story of trying to get legislation for mandatory training about suicide passed in Louisiana, where a room full of 34 people, every licensing board and their lawyer showed up and said, no fucking way. And I thought, oh, so you don't give a shit. But then I was nice. Anyway, go ahead, Bart.
So this is and I said this in my TED Talk, and I asked a few years, we have tolerated and we have decided that it is completely ethical to be poorly prepared and untrained and working with people at risk of suicide. We've done it in mental health. We've done it in healthcare. There is absolutely no standard of care. Do we have a standard of care for treating people at risk of suicide? The National Action Alliance just put one out, which we have certain people extremely worked up that we would even deign to suggest that providers meet a certain level of care in terms of identifying and treating people at risk of suicide, and the standards were bare minimum standards. So this is, to my point, we do not value the lives lost to suicide. We don't consider the suicide lives important enough to actually mandate that the providers of services in this country are adequately trained and held to a standard that would reduce suicides. And we're just talking about, my focus on this rant is just about people who are in the healthcare system. But I'll say this. I think that if better care was provided in the healthcare system, more people who aren't engaging in services would get services. If people had really good experiences when they had a suicide crisis and they talked about those experiences, more people would reach out to get help. So I think that that would actually build on the number of folks.
But let me say something about that. So you're right that we do have evidence and we know what to do with an N of 1. But what we know is, you're right, is if we were successful and we had standards, we know that the need we have would eclipse the resources. We know that, by the way. Like, I remember Dan Reidenberg saying in a meeting, he's like, we get really nervous about giving out the crisis line number because we know that if everyone called it, the system would break. And I said that again in a conference this week. If everyone who needed us showed up, we wouldn't be able to do what the evidence-based care. We wouldn't have enough people. And that does bother me because I don't think we can have enough people.
Yeah, about 140 people an hour, adults only, are hitting emergency room, ERs, every hour. That's it.
How many people are diagnosed with cancer a year? Do we know how many people are diagnosed with cancer a year?
I'm sure we could.
The problem is that cancer is like a lot of different things. So you're going to have to decide what you mean by cancer. But yeah, you can, those numbers you can take out. But you mean like everything that is over the cell growth, or do you mean like tumors, or what do you mean?
So in other words, so here's the point. If we trained primary care physicians at least to how to screen and get people linked into care. So this idea that we don't have enough providers, we have that many more cancer providers? And maybe we do. I mean, the analogy from our heart care providers, there can't be that many cardiologists. How many cardiologists are there in the country?
There are a lot more oncologists than mental health providers in Baton Rouge who are trained to respond to somebody at risk of suicide.
So this is to my point, because we haven't trained and made it a requirement that everybody that is in healthcare has some level of experience. And here's the other thing. For cancer treatment, if you're an oncologist, that requires an awful lot of training. You can train everybody in really solid suicide prevention strategies, and they don't have to have any fancy degree. They don't need to have any degree at all. Volunteers working at hotlines do amazing suicide prevention work. So this idea that somehow you need to, so let's even break this down even further. There's no evidence that licensed or degreed mental health professionals are any better than lay people at helping people who are having an emotional crisis. The research on this has been held up repeatedly over the years. We've got all of this credentials, and you've got to do this and do that, when the data doesn't suggest that licensed professionals are any better at helping people than lay people that you give some basic training to and go out there and say help people. So the data ain't there. If you've got it, share it with me. I want to see it.
So my husband got cancer. It was found by the primary care doctor. There was a lot of and then they cut out his thyroid, and here we are. And there were a whole lot of people involved in the care. But when we looked at doing high risk care for just the 8 to 9 million people at high risk, so that would take a specialist, like ongoing CAMS kind of care, that kind of thing. It would be every licensed provider in the country, when we did the math on that, would have to have a caseload of 50 to 60 patients only getting care for their high risk suicidality. And no other kind of treatment planning. And so if everyone at high risk showed up, I don't know. When we looked at that, like what the numbers would be to provide that, we would have to train and employ 1/3 of the U.S. workforce in mental health. That would be only to do high risk care for suicide for that 8 to 9 million people. When we did the numbers on that.
So, well, I mean, there's lots of challenges with that. I think that one, we don't really particularly good at figuring out who high risk is. And if you've got 10 million, if you've got 10 million people that are at high risk, only 45 to 50,000 of those folks are going to end up dead by suicide. So those numbers don't. So something's missing there, right?
That doesn't mean that doesn't want just a minute. Their fatality rate doesn't mean they won't be grievously harmed.
So we get to there's a million and a half attempts. So now you're down. Now you're 8 or 9 million. You're down to a million folks that are really the folks that you're focused on. And of those folks, how many actually attempts result in serious physical harm? That number is even smaller. So
right.
So
but we're talking high risk care for suicidality. Like what that care looks like to recover versus only if we could find 45, or if we could find the million people and provide a net or safe gun storage or whatever.
Let me expand on this. My point on this, because I don't disagree with you, but I think it's a matter of scale and what you're thinking. I don't think you need 10 million people in intensive suicide prevention care. I think it's abundantly clear that you don't need 10 million people in intensive suicide prevention care.
Well, it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to prevent death, that's one thing. If you're trying to prevent attempts, or you're trying to prevent, if you're just trying to prevent attempts, you don't need 10 million people in intensive care. If you have a system that's at least providing some care to that 10 million, that's evidence-based, that's where they're getting context and they're getting identified at primary care and they're getting some level of assistance, I think you bring down the rate tremendously without having to have 10 million specialists or whatever number, how many million specialists you think you need. I mean, that's just my approach. For what it's worth. Well, the risk assessment, given that Joe Franklin's paper says that your ability to predict risk is less than chance, good luck. Let me know once you fix the problem.
Well, that's my point. Why try to identify these?
You can't tell the difference between low risk and high risk, is what he's saying.
That's my point.
So that means you've got to treat all 10 million of them one at a time.
No, you don't. No, you don't.
With what? Have the evidence. You're saying we currently have the evidence and the resources and the means. And Tony's saying then you've got to do the whole enchilada because you don't have a magic little Sims diamond that pops above the heads of only the people who are going to attempt.
But there's a missing piece here. We don't have in any way an organized system of care to do this treatment in the first place. So I'm not saying what my point isn't, and I don't think we're disagreeing. What I'm saying is the scale and the scope I think is very different. I think a systemized approach that even used bare minimum standards in care, that didn't even have these millions of specialist trained providers doing this intensive ongoing therapy, would still have a significant impact and actually be much more cost effective than trying to do intensive care with 10 million people when you know that 90% of those folks don't even need the intensive care in the first place, and you're not very good at. I
mean, neither one is going to happen. Let's just be clear that there is no model for this. There is no compensation model. Neither one of these scenarios is ever coming true in the current climate.
There is no compensation model. There is no specific funding stream for suicide prevention specific activities, and the reimbursement rate for mental health activities in general is horrible.
So good people go elsewhere.
Yeah, but
here we are. Yeah, and so by the way, which brings me back to when market. And by the way, I love the little anger gif that you all posted about me. That is maybe my favorite because anger is an emotion that gets things done. Thank you. But which brings me back to the marketplace question, which is, is anybody surprised that the number went up? And I'm like, no, I'm not surprised. A lot of environmental stressors went up and not a lot of resources went up. What did you think was going to happen? We have the science of suicide that we paid for. We have the system of intervention that we paid for, which is to say not much. And there are valiant people out there. Somebody said they expect us to save the world every day, but with no fucking money.
Yes, that's true.
And so when people are like, are you surprised? No.
Well,
everybody's getting what they paid for, which isn't very much.
Let's think. So it's the number 10. So think about this for a minute. It's the 10th killer of human beings in the United States of America, 10th leading cause of death. And in the U.S., it's the second leading cause of death of youth under the age of 25. And a huge chunk of our suicide prevention efforts are propped up by not-for-profits using volunteer labor and resources, doing beautiful work right? Doing beautiful work. But the reason that we have volunteers and all this volunteer labor is because nobody in this country wants to fucking pay to provide decent care to people at risk of suicide. We're leveraging people who are volunteering their time. Imagine if your oncologist was a volunteer. Yeah, you know, we don't really think that much about people who have cancer. We'll use volunteer oncologists that just get you think you just donate some time. Can't you just donate some time to help out with this cancer treatment?
So
the ludicrousness of this situation is ridiculous.
Jonathan Singer says, we've moved the fuck away from talking about the media response. And Anne-Marie's like, wait, are we stepping into a heated debate? And the answer is maybe a little. So I will tell you that when we did get asked a lot of these questions by the media, there were these very measured, I will tell you, they really were these measured, on point. You've got 5 minutes in a phone call to do this. But I have to say, and I didn't expect this would happen, like we got, like this is not blush, I'm a little bit heated up. Like this was like really, really hard, like trying to get people to understand this. On Reddit, one of the top posts on Reddit was a 19-year-old who said, well, we're going to get a tech platform and bring everybody together and then they'll all be connected and then we'll redefine mental health. And I was like, I'm so glad, except for the part where, you know, like folks are in the media saying, we know why, there'll be a solution. The science, there isn't sufficient science to support the many narratives about why people die by suicide and what to do about it that we see all over the media. Most of them have been relatively science light. And I feel like that's a fair thing to say, and not readily acknowledging the underinvestment in this. And that's been really important. A big kudos to Kevin Hines, who I think did the smallpox quote, I think, on CNN like 3 times or something. And thank you, Anne-Marie and Zing, for getting us back on track. As we're going into the last 15 minutes, let's talk about what we think. When we looked in this Twitter thread, we saw everybody talking about all the interviews they did. Jen Battle, Amelia, Jess Stolman-Rainey, Anne-Marie. They're talking about doing all these local and Boston Globe and major news outlets, right? Like we heard about that, and like people in our community did interview after interview after interview this week. What is different from 5 years ago? What changed? And you'd like to say maybe it was, SPSM, but maybe it wasn't. What happened in our community?
Can I throw this one out there? Because what I noticed, and this is something that you and Tony and Bart have driven largely. So I think really it is SPSM driven, but what we've typically seen over the last, since I was paying attention for about 10 years, we have these typical, oh, here's a phone number, everybody give each other hugs and be nice, and here are things that we might know or maybe know. Now we have messages, and largely driven by what you guys have done, that includes very specific things in context, within the context of the actual suicide or within the actual issue at hand. So there are. It's not just a template. It's not just, this is the same information that we put out every single time. This is the particular angle. This is the particular messaging point that we want to focus on here because it's effective in communicating what we're trying to get across to the public. We do such a good job at talking to each other about this stuff all the time, and we tend to forget that the public may not know some of these really important pieces. And so if we can move some of that data, move some of this research into the public sphere in a way that's digestible and easily accessible through media, through social media, using these really key points, and stay focused on those, then that's what I've noticed, is that we've started doing that more than just putting out templates that say the same thing every single time.
It was really cool to see different people have different messages that were specific to their audiences, specific to that media outlet, specific to their expertise. Chris, do you have that Mike Anestis, his tweets, that he didn't tag them SPSM? Mike, don't make me text you. Don't make me come for you, Mike Anestis. Do you have those handy?
Those are in the text notes, so I can find them back. Yeah.
Would you be willing to read those? Can you do your best Mike Anestis impression? Nobody tell Mike Anestis that we're impersonating him tonight.
I am definitely not qualified for that.
We love you, Mike. I love you so much.
It really was the most. This thread. Oh God. Okay. So he's been and he really was. He was so instrumental in providing some really important interviews and media responses. Because, and that was another thing, is that we actually started seeing a ton of talk about firearms, especially around the CDC report. It's specifically in the report itself, but then people started picking up that messaging and making it, means safety in general a priority for the messaging. So he said, as he's been spending more and more time chatting with the media about guns and suicide prevention, I've been thinking more broadly about scientists and how we publicize our work. Here are some thoughts. Over the past several days, I have been having a lot of interactions with media. I truly believe that this is something that scientists need to be doing more of. If we want the world to learn from and embrace scientific findings, we have to be willing to step outside of journal articles and conference presentations. We have to develop a capacity for speaking about our findings in an accessible way without watering down the results. We have to humanize science by showing that scientists are relatable humans who care passionately about what they study and who wants to do meaningful work using their particular skill sets. We're not robotic, emotionless hermits, unable to grasp the complex realities of life. We're empathic, truth seekers, aware of the limitations of our insights, who view the scientific method as a path towards overcoming our biases and steering us towards evidence-based solutions. Funny thing is, if he's in a room of friends that he's known for a long time, I still sometimes find myself sitting quietly, assuming that when the topic is me, my words are not important or interesting. With the media, however, talking is easy. I know these words, plus the topic, firearms plus suicide, are important. Speaking about these topics with a large podium is my best chance to do something more meaningful than writing obscure scientific texts that live unread behind a journal's paywall. This isn't about attention seeking. If it were, attention wouldn't seem so overwhelming in everyday situations. This is about doing what is right and fully committing to a path of conviction towards affecting change. If you are a scientist in training, a doctoral student, a postdoc, etc., ask your mentors, scientific or otherwise, for help getting used to talking to the media. Take a shot at it yourself. Get better at this by taking every chance available to give talks about your work. Get in front of large audiences. Realize that sometimes you are going to do a terrible job, and the world will continue to spin on its axis, so you might as well get over it and do it again. Do this enough that you learn what folks who disagree with you are most likely to say, then practice disarming those arguments before they have a chance to raise them. Find your voice. Are you combative or diplomatic? Are you humorous or more of a hardcore nerd? Embrace whatever your voice is and then project it loudly and often, and do not stress about the fact that some advanced scientists look at this type of pursuit as somehow problematic. The reality is, at least in my own field of suicide prevention, the world is largely unaware of what we as scientists are doing. If we believe in our own work, that's a real problem, and it's only going to change if we change it. And then mic drop gif. So it's amazing. He's awesome.
And I can't imagine Mike Anestis like spiking a microphone and like in real life, but I totally like that he did that, which is awesome. And he has been trying to have the conversation about firearms and suicide in a way that is really science driven and in a way that makes a lot of sense from a healthcare or public health perspective. Just really saying, like, we can't not have this conversation. We don't have to have the crazy conversation. We can just have a conversation about firearms, because this is a large number of these deaths, and if we're going to be honest about it, we should have an honest conversation, right? And I want to really thank Mike, because Mike also did a wonderful job of saying that we don't have the same voice. The way that I want to talk about suicide, or the things that I'm going to focus on from my perspective, or Bart or Chris or Tony or Mike Anestis or Noreen, who's doing a cool podcast with women entrepreneurs about this topic, or Anne Marie or Jonathan Singer or Amelia Leto, or all the people who've been tweeting out things, or Lisa Sullivan. Like, they're going to be different. They're for different constituents, different points of views, different messages, and it's working, right? Like, this is a complicated issue, so it's not like we get 5 minutes to say the same 3 things, right? If we're effective, we're going to be able to have a conversation about firearms, because this is a large number of these deaths, and we get to talk about this a lot until something changes.
The point I really loved in there was his point about making sure that you have a chance to think through the arguments before they're raised. Because the way the world is, you're going to have, especially if we're talking about firearms, and I've seen him have some really engaging arguments, well thought out, logical arguments, and he tends to anticipate those questions and concerns. But even just thinking about like the more recent reactions to these celebrity suicides, think through some of the things that you want to respond to some of the more common negative responses, and just have those ready to go. And then just keep doing them. Like Tony has always said that too. Just keep doing it, keep trying it, keep doing the same thing. So to hear that come from Mike and Estes too was just overly validating.
And speaking of which, we're getting to final thoughts. Bart, do you have some for us?
So final thought, as we move forward, the diversity of viewpoints and the depth of response we're seeing is huge. I wanted to point out there were a lot of folks on conservative Twitter that were sharing their own stories with suicide, losing family members, their own personal struggle with suicide. There is all of the work that we've done to make it easier to talk about suicide is paying off. I think we're in the beginning stages of a cultural change. I think we're seeing it. And this is why I get really nervous when people do word policing and tell people how to tell their story or how we should talk about suicide, because I don't think that furthers our cause in the way that people think it furthers our cause. I saw lots of people sharing their stories in ways that many people would say was unsafe. I don't give two craps. I want people to tell their story. I want us telling our stories. So I think that that's a really good sign. And I think that the biggest change that I'm seeing is the organized response, that it's a diverse response, and that general people who have no connection to suicide prevention are paying attention and sharing their own experiences and are seeing things I never have seen that before, not in this way. So that's pretty incredible.
Tony Wood.
Keep talking. Keep speaking. Keep it up. Have a great summer, everybody.
Chris Maxwell.
Guys, don't get complacent. If we start seeing successes and we start seeing good media outreach and good media response, we cannot pretend like it will stay that way. Media professionals change so fast, and media happens so fast. We need to be able to respond just as quickly as we have now, and we are doing. But we need to make sure that we don't get complacent. We don't rest on our laurels. So keep doing it. Keep being badasses. You guys are amazing. Yeah.
So I'm going to wrap us up the last couple minutes, and if Bart needs to jump in and break it up, you go for it, Bart.
You go.
So this is the last couple minutes of SPSM, and like sort of in its current format, the way that we're doing it. It was really clear to us back in the fall that some sort of corner had been turned. We really started this with the goal of really creating transformative change and rapid growth in the suicide prevention and research communities. And in fact, we really think we've seen that happen. And whether or not, I mean, we think we were a really important part of that, as were a whole lot of other factors. But that, I feel like this week was the week where it was like, people know how to do this. And so many people knew how to do this. So many people were prepared and willing. They picked up, you know, their corner of the load and pulled the media forward. And it happened. I couldn't have from my sort of introduction to the suicidology community 6 years ago to today, I couldn't have imagined our community being as capable this week as 6 years ago. And I just want to say what a privilege it has been to know everyone and to watch everybody grow. We're going to be moving SPSM like sort of a version 2.0, like when it's sort of mission accomplished in terms of our goals. It's really time to do new projects. It's time to decide what's needed next. We're not there yet. 45,000 people died in 2016 and probably more in 2017 and 2018, quite honestly. So we have to look at other parts of the system, and the suicide prevention system has done a lot of changing and growing. And so now we have to look at other systems. other people we want to talk to or partner with, other things that we need to learn, and how can we use the skills that we have and the network we have to encourage change and growth, and where does that need to be? We would love for you to tweet out at us. We would love for you to message us. What kinds of things would you like to see? What do you believe is possible? What problems do you think that if we solve those would make a really big difference? What problems do you think are impossible to solve? You know, I remember, you know, when we showed up at AS and people were like, we don't tweet and we don't do media. And they thought it was really, really scary. And now pretty much everyone does it and they do it really great. The truth is, cultural change, system change can happen really quickly. What problems do you today seem impossible that you think if we solve them would make a difference? Hit us up with those. Like, we're really, we've been having sort of escalating discussions, this production team and a lot of our members of the community, about what needs to happen next. Like, come join us on the sidelines. When SPSM was planned, it was a bunch of people at a fancy Austin hipster hot dog joint. You all are our close friends. Help us figure out what you think needs to happen next, so that I believe there is a day when the CDC reports that the rate's going down for the first time. And I want to see that day. And I would like for us to, you know, play a role if possible in making that day come sooner rather than later. So with that being said, it is time to sign off. Everybody have a fabulous summer. We will let you know when the new things come out. It's very likely to be different than what we've done. So we will be cluing you in as this all gets built. You all are fabulous. Have a great time.
Bye, everybody. Good night.
Good night.